Ladies and gentlemen, welcome wrestling fans worldwide to Knoxville and the Great Smoky Mountains for the Ron Fuller Tennessee Studcast.
6 feet 9 inches tall, 265 pounds.
This historic podcast from one of the most respected and successful wrestlers and promoters will follow the footsteps of the largest and oldest wrestling family on the planet.
Listen to what I'm saying. That's right. Bring that camera in here a little bit closer.
Through 93 years and 4 generations.
The stud has arrived.
Old school or new fan, this unique broadcast will educate and captivate as Ron details decades of professional wrestling's growth with truly unforgettable stories.
I want those people out there at home to hear the stud.
Sit back and enjoy the ride with the Tennessee Stud.
The Tennessee Stud. You will learn that name. You will remember it.
And now,
the stud is here.
Episode number 2. It is hard for me to believe. Still pinching myself here at the opportunity because 93 years and 4 generations later, for the first time, the real story of the first family of wrestling will be told in its entirety. No stone left unturned. No secret kept. And it has been a secret till now. We unlock the vault. The mind of the Tennessee Stud, Ron Fuller. And Stud, episode number 2. Welcome back, my friend. Great to have you.
Great to be here. Very happy to be here and looking forward to it, man. Let's lay it out there for him today, Tony.
And before we do anything else, Stud, that is a tremendous intro to this program that I had absolutely nothing to do with. It's all you. That is a tremendous piece of imaging. Where did that come from?
That came from a personal friend of mine. His name is David Summers in Dothan, Alabama. He's a very, very talented guy, and I want to thank him. And I'm sorry that we didn't mention him last week because, as you were saying, Tony, this is not scripted. We're just laying it all out there, and we just didn't have an opportunity to mention him last week. But he does a tremendous job, and I think we will probably be changing our intro a little bit here and there. We'll be changing a few things that we started out with last week, and within the next 2 programs, he will be giving us some more great stuff, hopefully.
One of the things that we're going to do this week for sure is work in some interaction from the very active community that exists over on Facebook at the Ron Fuller Welch page. And if you have a question about anything, it doesn't have to be about today's show. It can be about any of the history of the Welch family, any story that you've heard about the Fuller wrestling family, anything that you want to know about, anything that Ron's been involved with. We can jump around, jump back chronologically. We aim to do this chronologically, but we can always go back and we can always go forward depending on the question. And later on in episode 2, we're going to tackle some of the questions that folks have sent in. And I know you've been humbled by the response because we've gotten them from all over the globe, which speaks to the reach of what you've done in your career and your family, Tennessee Stud, as well.
Right. I've been humbled by the whole experience. I'm not a big social media guy. I've got myself on Facebook, and I started to realize, Tony, that something that I never realized before is how popular I was and how people perceived me and how they enjoyed what I did. And I'm just inundated with comments that are just fabulous from fans and saying, you're a big part of my life. I went to see you when I was a kid and I did this and you were my favorite. And it's a very humbling experience, but it really taught me that wrestling's much bigger. You made a good point last week in the first Studcast. It goes beyond what other things, other sport. It encompasses people's, not just their minds, but their emotions and everything else. It's an intriguing sport, really. I'm just happy to be able to give people the perspective from someone who's lived it.
Well, case in point, dear friend of mine who also happens to be one of the great sponsors of my local radio show in Knoxville, where I've been on the air for, thank God, a quarter century, which is a minor miracle to anybody who knows me. But Bart Fricks is in our studio today as we record today, and he was telling you, as we had a break in the action a few minutes ago, that you're a childhood hero of his. When I found that out, I invited him down here, and I've known him for, a good 15 or so years. This is the first time he's been in my studio, which speaks to the power of wrestling. Because let me tell you something, he wouldn't be here otherwise, and that's okay. But the truth is that what you did and what guys in your profession did, the way the sport used to be presented compared to the modern day, and I'm not here to poo-poo what goes on now, but there's something that was in the soul about the way the sport used to be presented, and that's kind of what we aim to do here, is to put it back in that light so that we can all feel like little kids again as we hear you tell these stories. And you did that in episode 1. I want to commend you for that. You did that in episode 1.
I wanted to tell the history, but at the same time, I also want to tell stories about the people, so that I hope that those listeners out there get a feel for what my family was all about. And all these stories are real. I'm making none of these up. These are just from my memory and from riding down the road with my granddad and being educated at an early age to what wrestling was all about.
So when we left off, your grandfather had just arrived in Ohio, and he was wrestling in a territory there. Coinciding with that, there were all kinds of things going on across the country in some of the bigger markets in wrestling. You had mentioned Toots Mondt. You had mentioned Strangler Lewis and some other guys. But your father starts to carve out his own niche. In the flyover states, as we call them now, in a lot of the red states, your father had started to carve out his own niche in the heartland. And all of a sudden, you were telling us your father is born, and you want to pick it up from there. Go ahead.
Yeah. So my grandfather's there in 1924. He starts to wrestle in Columbus. My dad's born in that time frame, and at about the same time, just so that we can keep people abreast of the growth of the family in the sport, okay? About the same time that my dad is born, my granddad, Roy, has his youngest brother named Lester, and he's born at that same time. Now, Lester's going to become a star down the road. My dad's going to become a star down the road. My granddad has a sister named Bonnie. She marries a guy named Virgil Hatfield, and they have 3 sons during that period of time. Their last name is actually Hatfields, but when they start to wrestle, they become the Fields brothers. It's Lee Fields, Bobby Fields, and Don Fields. So now they're all young kids at this point in time, and these are 5 future stars within my family that are just being born. And one of them, Virgil Hatfield, that marries my grandfather's sister, he ends up being a referee. The family is growing, and right now it's just Roy doing his thing. But he, at about the same time, while he's still in Ohio, trains his brother Herb, and he trains his older brother Jack. Herb Welch was a fabulous wrestler. Herb Welch was 3 times world junior heavyweight champion. He was so good at one time that he held the title for 5 years straight. Nobody had ever held it that long. And he had a car wreck, and they took the title from him because he wasn't able to defend it. It darn near killed him, and he came back and started wrestling again after that. As time goes by here, Herb is a very good wrestler. Roy, obviously, is a very good wrestler. And those two won the World Tag Team Championships. Roy taught them just like he had been taught by Dutch Mantell and Cal Farley. He taught them to shoot. He didn't teach them to wrestle in the ring. He didn't teach them to bounce off the ropes. He didn't teach them anything other than how to hurt people and how to protect the sport. People have a tendency to come to you when you're a wrestler and they say, oh, well, that wrestling, it's all this and it's all that. When I grew up, I wanted to be. My dad started teaching me to shoot when I was 5 years old. I always wanted to be able, if somebody came to me and said, well, I don't know about this, show me this, show me that, I don't think that hurts. I was always in a position and had the ability to prove to people within 2 or 3 minutes that you don't want to do this. This is not for kids, and it's not phony, and it's real. That's the way he trained his brothers. He trained the first two brothers. Now you've got 3 wrestlers in the same family, and that's a first time in the history of wrestling.
So your father's born when?
My father's born in 1927.
Okay.
Roy went there in 1924. 3 years later, my father's born. About the same time, Lester Welch is born. Fields brothers, Bobby, Lee, and Don, they are born. The family is beginning to grow in stature and grow in numbers. And so he teaches Herb and Jack same way he was taught. My dad then, as he grows up, just an indication of how Roy thought and how he handled things. We didn't get to one. I want to back up here, and I'm very sorry that I missed this.
Go for it.
But when we talked last time about Dutch Mantell and Roy finally beating Dutch Mantell and Dutch sending him to Columbus, well, Roy was working in the oil fields in Borger, Texas, and he went to quit and say, I'm leaving, I'm going to wrestle. And a few guys knew that he was training to be a wrestler. Back in those days, that Borger oil field was one of the few in the United States. It had a lot of wells drilled within that particular area. There was a bully that was in there. In all that group, there was hundreds of guys that worked on the rigs there. And there was one particular guy that was big. Roy described him, he said he was kind of like a bear. He was probably 6 feet plus, which back in those days, we're talking early 20s, 6 feet plus, and well over 200 pounds. He dominated everybody there. He drove guys on those rigs crazy, humiliated them, treated them horribly. He didn't ever mess with Roy. And I don't know whether Roy said, I don't know whether he knew I was training to be a wrestler or whatever it was. But when Roy went back the last day he was in Borger, Texas, he went back and his buddies he'd shake everybody's hand, and along comes the bully. And he says, hey, I hear you're going to be a wrestler, huh? You're going to go to Ohio or someplace, And he goes, I've waited all this time, and I've never had anything to do with you, and I've never caused you any problems. With today is your day, right? So he makes a real big deal out of cornering Roy in front of, starts out to be one oil rig. Roy's a different type of guy. So he says, okay, he goes, it's big dirt here. He says, let's just go on out here in the middle of the ground here, and we'll find out who's toughest. Well, all the guys, they hear it and they see what's going on. They just come down from all the oil rigs. They come around and they form a big circle, probably 10 deep, and they're in the middle, Roy and the big guy. So Roy takes him down. Roy just takes him down. He puts an Oklahoma ride on him. Now, it's hard to explain how a wrestling hold, but simply an Oklahoma ride, it's a very big amateur move. All the amateurs use it. It starts with a grapevine, and a grapevine is when you take both your legs and you wrap them around one guy's leg, okay? And then you straddle, in an Oklahoma ride, you straddle the back of his body. If he's on his hands and knees, if you can imagine this, you run one leg in between his legs, you connect that to your leg, and then you reach across his body and you grab that left arm. You can't beat anybody with it, you can't hurt anybody with it, but you can control the big man. Roy was smart enough to know that this guy's really big and he's going to blow up. When you gain control of him, he's going to struggle. And the guy did. The guy, he had him on the ground. He puts the Oklahoma ride on him. And the guy gets to his feet and he jumps backwards and lands on him. That's figuring that, I'm big and heavy and he's going to let me go. I'm going to hurt him. And Roy just holds on to him. And he gets up again, he does it to him again. Finally, after 3 or 4 minutes, the guy's tongue's starting to hang out. He's blown. He's gone. This is what my granddad was all about. He could have, at that point, got up, stomped him in the face, and smashed his head or whatever, but his thinking was different than most people. Instead of doing that, he let go of one of his arms. He's holding his left arm with both arms. He runs it around that arm and behind his head. He has what's called an abdominal stretch. A lot of people have seen that wrestling move. They do it standing up. He's got an abdominal stretch, but they're on the ground. he has now total control of him, and he has a loose hand that he can do something with. So he reaches down and he unzips the guy's pants, and he reaches in and he takes out his you-know-what, okay? And he takes out his Peter. Let's just call it a Peter, okay? We're going to tell the whole story.
Okay.
We'll tell the whole story.
Whoa, okay. Go ahead.
So he takes out his Peter, okay? Now all the crowd of guys that hate this guy, they'd start cheering. They're like, whoa, look at this. This is something else. And he goes real loud. He says, look at that. He goes, no wonder this guy's such an ass. Can you believe how little this thing is? He starts humiliating him in front of all these hundreds of oil rig workers.
Now, that's a stretching story that we've
That's
never
a
heard.
really stretching
You're really
story.
stretching somebody
That's
there.
a really stretching story. So he, instead of busting him up, instead of breaking him up, he humiliates him, which is, in my opinion, after him telling me his story, I saw it instantly. I said, couldn't have done anything worse to him than that, right?
You couldn't do anything worse than me. I know that.
And he finishes humiliating him, and he turns him loose, and he gets up. The guy's just laying there, and he's got his head down now. He's like, oh, my God, this is just hard. What am I going to say to this? How am I going to live through this? And Roy just starts walking through the crowd. And the oil rig guys, they just part like the Red Sea for him, and he walks right through. They're shaking his hand and patting him on the back, and God, that was great, Roy, geez. And that he never came back. He walks away, and that's the end of his experience with the oil rig. Now, I wanted to tell that story because I think it gives people the perspective of what Roy was all about. I mean, he could have been an animal, and he decided, let's do it a different way. So he goes to Ohio. Now we're in Ohio. My dad is born. He trains his two brothers to wrestle. And my dad grows up at about 4 or 5 years old. He has real curly hair. He goes down the street a lot, and he plays with a kid that's older than him. Same bully situation as we kind of talked about here. And my dad comes back and tells Roy, he says, Dad wore a hat all the time. He says he treats me bad and he hurts me. And he says, what do you mean he hurts you? And he says, well, he'll take my hat off and he'll grab my hair. And he says, I got all these curls and everything, and he just yanks my head and he drags me and pushes me onto the ground and all that. So Roy says, well, let's take care of that problem. And so Dad says, okay, he's just a young boy, He goes, okay, well, what do we do? And he says, well, first of all, he cuts his hair off. He just shaves his head. My dad's head. He's like 4 years old, 5 years old. And he puts the hat back on his head. And he says, now I want you to go back down there where the boy is. And he says, when he takes your hat off and he reaches for your hair, he said, I want you to grab a double handful of his hair. And he said, I want you to yank out as much of it as you can. Just start pulling and jerking his hair until he screams and cries. So Dad goes back down there, does exactly what he says, and never had a problem with the kid again. Roy had an uncanny knack of how to put people in their place without hurting them. And if he did have to hurt them, then he did what he had to do. So he's grown now to be a star in both Columbus and Toledo. He's a sharp guy. He sees what's happening. He sees that wrestlers get paid a little and promoters get paid a lot. Okay? And he says, now I've talked, this is stories. We ride down the road, and I say, how did it all happen? How did you get to Tennessee? And he says, I figured out pretty quickly that the real money is in owning it, not just being a wrestler. He says, I went to an area where I didn't think there was probably any wrestling much going on. So he goes to Tennessee. He picks a town to live in called Dyersburg, where I was born. Dyersburg, Tennessee. It's about 80 miles north of Memphis, just east of the Mississippi River. And he settles down there. With him goes Herb and Jack and all of his family members, his sister Bond, who has the 3 young boys, the Fields brothers. Everybody moves to Dyersburg. And he starts to build his territory. So, I was very curious about how do you do that? How do you build that kind of a business? So he said he would find where they had wrestling. Let's say Memphis as an example. And he started in big cities. He found out that they were having a match in Memphis. So he went to Memphis. He waits until almost bell time. And he said then he would go to the dressing room, one of the dressing rooms, and he would kick the door open. And he would go into the dressing room and he'd introduce himself. He'd say, "Hey, my name's Roy Welch." And he would look at everybody, take his time, methodically, let them all grasp it. What's this all about? And he'd go, "None of you guys are wrestlers. In fact, all of you are impersonating wrestlers." And he goes, "As of right now, you're going to take off your gear if you've got it on. You're going to put it in your bag, and you're going to walk out this door, and I'll never see you again." And so I asked him, I said, "Well, geez, did they do it?" And he said, "Bunches." He said if there was 3 guys in there, he said 2 of them would get up and go. And he said 1 would stay sometimes. And I said, "Well, what happened with that 1 guy?" And he said, "Well, usually I would say, so you're going to stay. You think you're tough, right?" And the guy would say, "Whatever." He had a way of doing it. I saw him do this to a couple of guys. I asked him, "Well, what would you do?" And he said, "I would grab him in the throat." And I had seen it. And what he did is he would take his hand and he would take that thumb and stick it into his esophagus. Drive it in there really deep so he cut off his wind. He said I would pull him face to face with me. And he said I would put him up and I would growl in his ear like a bear. Give him one of those growls. And then he said that I would tell him, "You don't want this. You don't want none of this. You better get your shit and go, And he said, a lot of times that was all it took. And I said, "Well, what happened if it didn't?" He said, "Then he paid the price. If he stayed, he paid the price." And I said, "Well, what would you do?" And he said, "I did whatever I had to do." And then he said, "But I was trying to build a wrestling business." He said, "There wasn't very few wrestlers. He said, other than my brothers, I didn't know hardly anybody." So he said, "These were the guys I wanted." He said, "That meant this guy had guts. He had balls enough to stand up to me." And he said, "They might kick his ass and leave him laying, and then I would help him to his feet and say, 'You want to be a wrestler? I think you may have a shot.'" And he said, I would take that guy and I would train him. He said, then I would go across to the other dress room and do the same thing. Kick the door in, do the same thing, run off the yellow dogs, and keep the best of the bunch. And then he would ask them, "Where's the guy that runs it?" The promoter. And he would go to the promoter and he'd do the same thing with the throat deal, except he never had any problem with the promoter because the promoters were small and they weren't athletes and they weren't tough. And he would drag them up there and whisper in their ear and tell them, "You're finished. You're not a wrestling promoter. You're nothing to do with wrestling. If I ever see you anywhere promoting or having any type of wrestling match, you are going to be in trouble." And he said, I closed the town. I would then go to the ring, get people's attention and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Roy Welch, and there'll be no wrestling here tonight. You can go home." And he would shut him down. He shut down town after town. He took Memphis. He took Nashville. He took Chattanooga. He took Knoxville. He just spread himself out, and he started taking over any competition that was there, so that it became known pretty shortly that there's this guy here, and he's a really bad son of a gun, and you don't want to have a wrestling match without his permission. So he strong-armed his way into creating the first territory. And it was one of the initial territories. It became so large that he expanded into Arkansas. He expanded into Missouri. He went into Kentucky. He went into West Virginia. He went into Virginia. It was Tennessee. It was Alabama. It was Mississippi. It was Louisiana. It was everything basically from the Ohio River to the Gulf of Mexico. And if you want to go on around wrestling there, you had to deal with Roy. that was a bad situation for anybody. They didn't want to mess with him, so they quit operating there.
So as he built his territory, who were some of the guys that would have been wrestling for him at this time in those states?
Moody Palmer. Now, we're talking about the 1930s, okay? We're talking Depression era when he told me that they used to wrestle. Gas was $2 a gallon, okay? And they would, and the payoff was 50 cents. You'd wrestle for 50 cents. He said a lot of times they couldn't pay guys 50 cents. They might make less than that. He said that the guys that he found, he had to train almost all of them. Okay, so they became his group, his guys that he could depend on, his stars, and he used those wherever he went. He said he had such a group of nasty people, they were all so nasty. He said they used to ride in the car together, and they would get in fights in the car. They would be riding along, two in the front, two in the back, and the two in the back would go at it. Yeah, you son of a bitch, and they'd get into it. He'd pull the car off, open the doors, and yank them out and let them continue out there on the side of the road. Boom, boom, they'd fight, they'd bust each other's eyes, whatever it was, and he would watch. I said, well, what did you do? And he said, I watch. He said, I know when they're getting tired. When I saw that they were both ready to quit, I would go, time! And they would drop their hands and get back in the car and sit there side by side, both bleeding, knock off the sweat and wipe the blood off, and they would continue down the road. He said, might happen twice in the same trip. He said, sometime Herb and I traveled together a lot, so he said, I would drive and Herb might be sitting in the passenger seat, and he said, on one occasion he could remember that they had bought some plates. When you bought gas back in the day, I can almost remember this far back. I hate to say it, but I remember when they used to give you plates. If you bought filled up your tank, you got a dozen plates or whatever it was. He said that they had filled up and got the plates, and they had put them in the back window. He was driving the car. So one of the guys that sat in the back seat got mad at him. He's driving, so the guy figured, well, he can't do nothing to me from here. So the guy reached up there and slapped him upside the head, right? He didn't even slow the car down. He just put his feet on the roof and walked his way over into the back seat on top of the guy. And Herb slid over and just kept driving the car, just kept the car going. And then he said, then I learned how to car fight. I said, well, what do you mean car fight? And he said, well, I used to jerk them out and let them fight. He said, but when you car fight, he says, if you can get a guy on his back in the back floorboard, he said, he's yours. He has no way he can fight his way out. So he said, I'd just walked myself into the back seat. He said, I grabbed the guy, stuffed him down into the floorboard, got on top of him, and he said, I reached up there and started with those plates. I'd take a plate and break it over his face, and then I reach and get another one. He said, Herb's driving 80 miles an hour down the road, and I'm breaking plates on the guy's face. And I said, once you get to the end of the plates, he said, guy's pretty bloody. We had to stop. Okay, Herb, pull over. He said, we drug him out and left him laying there for a little while, and he came to again, and they put him back in, and he went ahead and wrestled that night. He said it was like crazy atmosphere. One time, he told me a story about he didn't have enough wrestlers, and they had 4 guys on the cart, and they only had 3 guys in the car. So this was the old days, and everybody hitchhiked. There were a lot of poor people. He saw a big guy on the side of the road. He was hitchhiking, so he pulled the car over, and he says, hey, the guy got in. He asked the guy, where you going? I don't know, wherever I can go. It's bad times looking for a job. And he says, well, you ever wrestle? And the guy goes, no, well, a little bit, but I don't know nothing. He said, well, we're wrestlers, and you're going to wrestle tonight. We need a guy. So he takes this guy, and they put him in the ring. They get 2 out of 3 fall. They wrestle single match, 2 out of 3 fall tag, and they scuff him up. They mat burn him. They don't hurt him too bad because they need him to get him through a 40-minute, 50-minute, hour-and-a-half match. Keep them there and keep the fans entertained. And they stretched him really good. And when it was all over, the guy went back to the dressing room. He's hanging his head, and he's huffing and puffing, and his knees are bleeding, and his elbows are bleeding, and he's just all scraped and scratched. And it came time for the pay. So Roy goes around and he says he gives Herb, whatever it was, 50 cents, and he gives the other guy 50 cents, and he gives the hitchhiker. He said Herb took the money, he was happy to get it. The other wrestler took the money, he was happy to get it. He gave the hitchhiker the 50 cents, and the guy went, "Are you nuts?" He goes, "You guys do this for 50 cents? He goes, "Oh, you got to be crazy. Do you do this every night?" And he says, "Hell yeah, we do it every night." The guy went, "God almighty." He said, "It made me so mad." He said, "Then I beat the hell out of him after all that." He said, after he bitched about the payoff, I said, "Well, now I want to kick your ass." He said, "Well, I think I will." So he just went ahead and whipped his ass. It was a strange time. There were other people. Now, things are going on in the country now at this time, okay? We're in the 30s now. You got out west the funks. You got guys like Dory Sr. that's starting to develop in Amarillo. You've got like Paul Bosch in Houston. You've got in the east, you've got Jack Pfeffer, and you've got these guys along the eastern seaboard. They're starting to organize a little bit. They're starting to get connected and say, "Hey, I'll run over here on a so-and-so, and I'm going to run over there." And people started dividing the country. People started controlling. They started to say, "Okay, we're going to control this area. This is going to be my towns." So my granddad started with Tennessee. He spread into in Arkansas. He spread across 12 states. At one time in the 40s and into the 50s, he ran 12 states. He ran 25% of America was under the control of Roy Welch. 25% of the states, 12 out of the 48 states, he operated business in, and you didn't mess with him. You went in there, and there were times people tried to set up opposition. They tried to have their matches, and he did the same routine he did when he started it. He would go and kick the dressing room door open and beat the hell out of whoever it was, and that was how he controlled his business.
So we've introduced some new terminology here. We have car fights.
Oh yeah.
We have a guy, shall we say, getting exposed and stretched.
Oh yes,
in a different way.
Oh yes.
We've had some interesting stuff here in segment 1. Now, when we come back from this break, we are going to, for the first time, take some questions from some folks that are enjoying the podcast over on the Facebook page today, which is Ron Fuller Welch at Facebook. Again, Ron Fuller Welch. So if you want to get a question in, perhaps we'll deal with it. In the meantime, a few messages, and then we're back with more of your Studcast, Studcast 2, as we continue right after this.
All right, thanks for this opportunity. I want to take it to speak to my fans directly here. I'm just so overwhelmed by the response from the first Studcast. It was absolutely unbelievable. Also, the critiques from people were amazing. I haven't had one bad comment from anyone. I want to thank you, all of the members that are on Ron Fuller Welch on Facebook. There's also now, because of the great number of fans that I've picked up and friends that I've picked up, there's a second Facebook site. It's Ron Fuller, the Tennessee Stud. You can friend me there, like me there. I want to keep that growing. I want to thank everybody, like I said, again, for the tremendous response of the first Studcast and the great comments about it. You can join us. Our website is ronfullertennesseestud.com. And obviously the Studcast is going to be on there every Monday. They'll be available. They may even potentially be available on Sunday nights. We want to jump it up because we've had such tremendous response. Some people have just begged to have it on Sunday, so we'll be giving you some news about that in the near future. Thanks again so much for all of you and listening to our Studcast and also supporting us and telling your friends about us. We sure appreciate it, and God bless all of you.
You are back, seated ringside on this edition of the Ron Fuller Studcast.
RonFullerTennesseeStud.com. Make sure you check out the website. Also, if you want to ask a question, go to the Facebook page, Ron Fuller Welch. And Tennessee Stud, I welcome you back. Now, for the first time, we're going to do some questions, and I want you to go ahead and get right to that, my friend.
Okay. This I really like, Tony. I'll be honest with you. I've done some of this from the early days when I started wrestling in Florida. I've gone on shows that were 3-hour talk shows. In the early days of talk shows, they have me scheduled for 30 minutes and end up doing the whole 3 hours because people call in. I like taking the calls. So this, for me, is fun. I'm just going to start out here. We've got a lot of questions here that people have sent me, and this first one is from a guy named Robert Counts. He's in San Francisco, California, and he says, is there a wrestler that comes to mind that you never work with and particularly wish you had? Which is a good question, and thinking about it, I wrestled a whole lot of world champions in my time, and the one guy, I was a younger guy when he was still around, that I would have probably liked to wrestle is a guy that was world champion at one time named Buddy Rogers. He was the first Ric Flair. In fact, I think that's where Ric Flair got to be Ric Flair, was from looking at Buddy Rogers. Buddy Rogers had great physique. He had charisma back in the day before charisma was really important. And he was very good. He was a great wrestler. I saw my dad wrestle him. I saw Lester wrestle him. I saw a couple of the Fields brothers wrestle him for world championships, wrestling world championship matches, and obviously they did beat him. But he is the one guy I would say that, picking somebody, that would be a guy that I would really have liked to have wrestled.
And to your point, there's online recently been some video that surfaced of Ric Flair and Buddy Rogers in the series of matches that they had together back in the early 80s. And Buddy had to be climbing the ladder back then, but his physique, the way that he presented himself in the ring, his style, the way that he worked, tough guy.
Oh, yeah.
Tough guy.
A class guy.
And a class guy.
A class guy. I mean, that's what.
Great combination, right?
Yeah. I mean, you hardly ever see that. I mean, he had it all. He really had it all, and that's one reason I was attracted to him. That I was a kid. I was 12, 14 years old, and I was pretty well amazed. I said, "Damn, this guy's got real talent."
So Robert Counts, thank you. That's a great question out of San Francisco. Who we got next, Stud?
Okay, we've got here Will Wheeler out of Martinez, Georgia. And he asked me, how many shots at the NWA World Heavyweight did you receive? Best of my knowledge, I went back and tried to figure out, and I wrestled at least 10 times for the NWA World Championship. Now, he's talking about NWA. We'll just keep this to the NWA, okay? But I wrestled during my career a lot of world champions, NWA champions, that weren't champions, that had been champions, or that were going to become champions. And I was kind of thinking about this. I wrestled Lou Thez. So did my father, and so did my grandfather.
So how old would Fez have been when you got
he
in
was
the ring
probably
with him?
65, in his 60s, when I wrestled him.
Do you have, because at that point you're probably somewhere between a kid and a seasoned wrestler, are you nervous before you get in the ring with an all-time great?
Oh, gosh, are you kidding? Hell yes. I mean, Lou Thez, to me, was one of the greatest NWA champions of all time. In fact, when they formed the National Wrestling Alliance, he was their first champion, okay? And he was everything Buddy Rogers was, except he shot. He had a persona about him. He had great physique. He was very intelligent and just a phenomenal wrestler. And if he had a problem, he handled it in the ring. And he had few problems because all the other wrestlers knew he could handle it in the ring.
And you had to know that, even as a kid. So if I step out of line here with this guy, if I mess up, if I take a liberty, if I make him look bad, I could get hurt here.
Oh, well.
And you had so much respect for him, you'd let him hurt you.
Oh, yeah, and he probably did hurt me a couple of times in that match. I mean, Lou was very tight and rugged, and I call it stiff. So I wrestled Lou. I wrestled Pat O'Connor. Pat O'Connor won the championship from Lou Thez, actually, and I wrestled O'Connor, and he became a personal friend of mine. He came to Knoxville when he was in his 60s and wrestled for me with Southeastern Wrestling. He was, like I said, a friend, and I spent a lot of time. Gene Kaninsky, we're talking way back, big Canadian, 6'5", 275, 280, bald-headed. I wrestled him in St. Louis, and he was a load. I could see why he was the champion. It was my third year in the ring, and I saw I was wrestling Gene Kaninsky. I was like, oh, geez, man, it's going to be a long night.
Now, how was he toward a young wrestler like you? Here's a guy that's been all over the world. He's an all-time great. Is he kind toward you? Does he initiate you? How'd that go?
Well, he was very respectful. He was very nice, but and I was beginning to be good. This was 1974. A lot of people were saying I was going to be champion. There was talk that I would be a world champion. And I probably would have been had I not started my own wrestling company and eliminated myself from traveling. My first 4 years, I went to Australia. I went everywhere. I went to all the Caribbean. I wrestled in all the different territories and tried to start making a name for myself. I remember wrestling Gene, and I remember at one point in the match, I threw him in the ropes. I dropped down, and I flying head scissored him with him running. And when the match was over, he came to the dressing room, and he said, "Kid," he goes, "nobody's ever done that to me." He said, "at your size and your height and your ability to move like you move," he goes, "it's pretty astounding, He was very complimentary, He beat me, obviously, but he came, and I was impressed by the fact he came, and he says, you're going to be good.
And guys like that teach you, when you're older, how to handle the kids that come after.
Oh, yeah.
You learn a lot from that. You probably don't know you're learning that. But you're learning the right way to treat somebody.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You learn. The wrestling is like that. I mean, when you go in I don't care where it is, there's a certain way you present yourself and you handle yourself. When I went to Australia, as an example, you go in the dressing room and you're with guys from all over the world. You've got Mario Milano from Italy. You've got Spiros Arion from Greece. You've got Sabu Singh from India. You've got all these guys that you've never met. You don't know who the hell they are, some of them, when you first go. I always went immediately and shook every man's hand, introduced myself, and said, I'm Ron Fuller, and nice to meet you. I've heard about you. Compliments are exchanged normally. There's a certain amount of respect, and you do the same thing when you finish a match. You usually go and shake a guy's hand and say it was a great match, and you're really good, and that's customary.
I remember Archie Goldie, Mongolian Stomper. Mm-hmm. He told me one time he was working an independent event here later in his life. And he had showered before the match, brushed his teeth, put on some good cologne. He said, I want to show the person I'm in that ring with respect. And he said, I learned that early in my career. That's what you do. You don't go out there all haggard. You go out there, but you show respect to that person you're in the ring with, even if it's a kid. Independent deal.
Oh, absolutely.
That's a neat lesson, man.
You brought me to another story here. I'm gonna switch gears here a little bit, but you've reminded me of something. Okay, back in the early days, reverting back, we were talking about in the 30s. Herb was very good. There was a wrestler, I can't remember his name, but my granddad told me the story. He said he was a farmer during the day, and he was a rugged old guy, and he never took a bath. So he had come directly from the farm and go right into the dressing room and right into the ring. And he stunk. I mean, he smelled horrible. So Herb told him, one night, there's a 2 out of 3 fall match. After the first fall, he said, you stink. He goes, you got to take a shower or get yourself cleaned up before you go out in the ring. And the guy said, he kissed my ass. He said, whatever he wanted to, like kiss off, So Herb, I don't know, we're gonna get edgy here again. I hope this ain't gonna get too much for the audience, but so Herb, this is the type of guy Herb was. Herb goes over in the break. About the time this bell rings for the second fall, the guy goes to the ring, and Herb takes a poop and takes it and puts it underneath his armpit. and he goes to the ring. They ring the bell, and he goes straight across, and he grabs the guy in the headlock, twists his head around, and shoves it into his armpit and clamps down on him. And the guy starts screaming, and he takes him down on the mat. Now all he's got's a headlock, and the crowd's wondering what in the hell's going on. And the guy is just kicking and flailing and I can't take it. Finally, Herb lets him go, and he jumps up, and he's got it all over his face. And he screams, and the crowd's still quiet. They're like, what in the heck is this all about? And he goes, referee, this man has the S word, right? So that's kind of what you did. That was Herb's disrespect of a guy who did not clean himself up properly and took no pride in himself and came to the ring dirty. I doubt that a guy ever did that with Herb again. I'll guarantee you the guy. In fact, the story was Roy said that guy took a shower every time he came before he went in the ring.
Because there's a sense of respect. There's a sense of where we're going to respect each other. We're going to respect the moment. We're going to respect the other person's body, their livelihood. We're not here to kill each other.
Yeah,
we're not back in the 19-teens like we started our podcast. So you've got time for another question if you want to squeeze one more in there.
Okay, let's see. This one, this is I'm going to call this the question of the day. I told fans that I would take the question of the day and I would send them a photo. And this is my winner here. This question here, and this is an up-to-date question here, and this is from a John Nicole in Orlando, Florida. And the question was, what was the business environment for you in the early 80s during WWF expansion? Did you think it was possible to go national? Did you think it would fail? Lastly, were you offered a payout by Vince? Tremendous question. And I think fans really don't know much about the 80s and what happened in the Vince McMahon era. This may take me a few minutes. We got a few minutes?
Go for it.
Come back. Okay. First of all, no, I was not offered a buyout. At that point, I had Continental Wrestling, and we were doing very well. In fact, we were training and had trained some of his stars that were going to make his business. Hulk Hogan, Honky Tonk Man, Arn Anderson. It was a litany of guys that came with us, started with us, that went from us on to Brutus the Barber Beefcake. I mean, it just went on and on and on. So, no, we weren't offered a buyout, and I was fairly sharp in the wrestling business. And when Vince went on TV and had his NBC, his first national broadcast, I had already been approached by a company. I had a company out of Houston, Texas, that was selling Continental Wrestling to the Middle East for me. We were on in Saudi Arabia, and we were on in Qatar, Arab Emirates. We were getting some notoriety outside the United States. And those people came to me and they said, Ron, your talent is tremendous. Your product is really great. We have a connection in New York. NBC is looking for wrestling. They are thinking about trying to do wrestling nationally again. Would you be interested? Because I was a member of the National Wrestling Alliance, because I had grown up in that business, and I knew all those promoters, I had tremendous respect. It goes back to that respect. I had tremendous respect for how hard they all worked and what they'd had to give up to get to where they were. I could have said, guys, yes, take me to New York, let's do the deal. But I got to thinking, if I do that, I'm going to be in a position to hurt them all. So I told them no, okay? Vince Sr., I worked for Vince Sr. in Madison Square Garden twice. I worked for Vince Sr. in Philadelphia. I liked Vince Sr. He came to the National Wrestling Alliance meetings. He was not a member, but he was a smart enough and a respectable enough gentleman. He came. He was treated just like he was part of the NWA. And in return, he was a good guy. Now, when Junior took over, it was a different deal. He asked me here, the business environment in the 80s was good. There were territories kicking butt. Everybody was doing big business. Then he asked me, do you think it's possible to go national? I kind of answered that. It was possible. I could have done it, but I decided not to. I did not think, he asked me, did I think I would fail? I knew that Vince Sr., he was a big man promoter. He liked the big guys, but big guys couldn't do what smaller guys did. I was a product of my family lineage, and we believed in wrestling. We believed in shooters. We believed in movement. We believed in story. We believed in all the things that Vince did not believe in. Because Junior saw Vince's operation, that's why he liked Hogan. That's why he liked Ultimate Warrior. He liked the big bodies. He liked the bulk. You didn't have to be an athlete. You didn't have to know how to wrestle. I never used those guys. I always wanted my athletes to be wrestlers. I wanted my fans to see the best and not see the bulk. I wanted them to see what it was all about. So I took a different approach. But if I had gone to New York and taken that show, I would have done something totally different, and the landscape of wrestling today would be nothing like it is. I would have gone to all those NWA promoters and say, I have a national vehicle for all of us. Rather than saying, for me, I want to be the man, I would have said, let's all be the men. Let's take this sport to another level, but in a different way than Vince went. Vince says, let's put them all out of business, and I say, let's put them all in business. I would have said, send me your best guys. I would have had the best wrestling program anyone had ever seen. I would have been able to put Roy Shire's guys. I would have been able to put Ray Stevens against the Dusty Road. You would have seen the finest wrestling product that would ever been done, and we'd have all been in business.
Imagine that. You could have had Crockett's guys. You could have had Owen's guys out there in Oregon. You could have had the guys
Fritz's guys.
Yeah, Fritz's guys. And certainly there would have been room for that if you could have gotten everybody to cooperate. What would have been really interesting, though, is that the sport would look completely different than it looks now, because now what you have is, and God bless the kids that are trying today, but you got kids today that can't cut a promo unless it's written for them.
Yeah.
That's what they've done to the business.
Yeah.
And so you've ripped the soul out of it. You've ripped the personality, and you've ripped the soul. And I still watch because it's what's there, but it's not what it was. In fact, it's not even close.
That's it. It's not the same product that it was, and it could have still been to this very day. And if you think about the number of wrestlers that ended their career within a 2-year period, and more than that, the thousands and thousands of fans across America that live by that television program every week, and going down there and seeing those guys, they disappeared overnight, and they never knew what happened to them. What happened to all these wrestlers why is it just one group, one show now? You know what's really funny? Everybody says Vince is so successful. Vince has a huge crowds, and Vince's numbers are just bigger than they ever were. It's bullshit, because what's actually happened, I'm going to lay it on the line here.
Go for it.
I'm never going to make Vince's Hall of Fame after this deal, but I'm going to tell the story like it is. I'm not going to scoot around Vince. I'm going to tell the story the way I see it. Vince took advantage of a lot of promotions. Rather than buying out, he bought out a few of the last companies, but he took other companies' best stars and came and used them against them to put them out of business. The way it was done, it shouldn't have been done. It wasn't necessary. We would have had a better product today. We would have had the same type of wrestling that was here in the 80s. All those territories, when you think about a Friday night, let's say any Friday night, you had them running probably 30 cities across the United States. All of them were averaging 5,000 to 10,000 people, okay? You're talking about potentially on a Friday night watching wrestling in America. 20 times one WrestleMania a year's crowd every Friday night. So he not exploded the company, the wrestling business. He imploded the wrestling business. He killed it down to the point that now it's big It's more known nationwide, but it is less by far in the number of audiences, the number of people that are interested, the number of wrestlers have died. They were great wrestlers that just disappeared. I was one. I'm going to tell you the truth. I saw it coming. I said, I don't think anybody's going to be able to compete with him. I'm going to sell out. That's why I didn't need him buy me out. I said, it's time for me to go. And that's basically 1987, 88. That's when I left.
Yeah, nothing sadder than watching poor Vern Gagne up there choked to death.
Imagine. Who was one of the greatest wrestlers of all time? Vern Gagne was a tremendous athlete, Olympic wrestler, and a great guy. I spent a lot of time with Vern and his son. He was a great guy, very, like almost all the promoters in the country, very respectful, had a lot of integrity. They told you something, they did it. It was a grand era, and I'm glad I was during that. I was part of that grand era, but it's a sad place where it is now, in my opinion.
And so in our next Studcast, when we go back, we're going to pick it up back here in the late 30s and tell the story from there, because there's so much ground to cover from the time that Vince McMahon got his hands on the sport and unfortunately changed it forever. And as Bobby Heenan said, you cannot go back and undo it. The toothpaste is not going back in the tube, and that's too bad, because I feel sorry for the kids that'll never get a chance to be impacted. I talked about my friend Bart who's sitting in the studio. There are kids that will never get a chance to be impacted the way you, your family, and the other folks treated the sport. It won't get that treatment again. And you will not have that connection. These kids today that see it, they're getting toys sold to them, and they're seeing the illusion, but they're not getting the soul of it.
Yeah.
And I believe that in my heart. I really believe that.
Oh, that's true. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. When you believe, you believe. And if you believe, you are going to be a fan for life.
Yep. And you got to have respect for it, though, to make it believable.
Yep.
You yourself, as a promoter, you have to have respect for it, and we're back to that respect word again.
It starts at the top. What happens in your company starts with you. I make the decision, just like I said. When I look for talent, I look for something different than what Vince Jr. looked for. I look for the Bob Orton Jr.'s. I look for the Dick Slaters. I look for the guys that could do it. And, they didn't have to be big. They didn't have to be muscular, but they could make it happen in the ring.
Tennessee Stud, it's been a tremendous honor. Really appreciate your time, appreciate the thoughts, and we're going to come back in episode 3 and pick this thing right up, this great story back in the late 30s.
We got a lot to talk about, Tony. We got a bear coming pretty soon, the first wrestling bear. So,
Wrestling Bear, maybe the Wrestling Bear will make its debut or its first appearance here on the Studcast in episode 3. In the meantime, Ron, thanks.
Thank you very much, Tony. Been my pleasure.
For the Tennessee Stud, Ron Fuller, this is Tony Basilio reminding you, check out the website, ronfullertennesseestud.com. Also, join the Facebook page, Ron Fuller Welch. When you do, in either spot, ask a question, and hopefully you can get yours answered on the air. If not, I'm sure the Stud will be answering them on the Facebook as we go. For the Tennessee Stud, one more time, my name is Tony Basilio. Check us out on episode 3. And in the meantime, have yourself a great day. Thanks for joining us on your Studcast.
Thanks for joining us today for this historic Studcast. The true story continues next week. So full Nelson your friends and point them in our direction for another ride with the Tennessee Stud.
1, 2, 3.
This is David Summers saying so long from the Great Smoky Mountains.